There we go. Thank you to all of our panelists for taking the time and effort to prepare and share these videos. Now I'd like to hand it over to, or I'd like to start the Q&A session, and I see that we're getting some great feedback from our audience. I will ask our experts to come online and start their video if they're so able. And I'll just take it from the top. Some of these questions are addressed to specific specialists based on or in response to their presentations. However, given that we've got such a broad breadth of experience and expertise on this panel, I certainly welcome any of our other experts to jump in where they feel they can contribute. This first one is directed to Dr. Gorelick, asking him to please elaborate on how putting projects on a list is a way towards obtaining grant funds. I think he's challenging you there to say that sounds like a pretty simplistic piece of advice, but how does that feed into a larger strategy?
Sure, glad to help, and thank you for inviting me to be part of the panel. I think that we probably need to be clear on what we would be able to do through this sort of a platform, but I've seen this done successfully in other sectors where there's a platform and you effectively break it into two sections. The first section being those projects that are seeking grant or non-repayable funds. The second being those that are seeking funds that would be repayable, whether at market or concessionary rates. And I think that everybody on this call would probably understand what that repayable one looks like. But the reason why I think that it's not necessarily happening in a way which is most effective is because of the fact that there is not necessarily a sense of where the projects are or what the opportunities look like. And the reason why I'm saying that is because sitting in the role of being an impact investor in the WASH sector, I find that it's very difficult to find projects to invest into. And it actually becomes something which is highly time consuming, not just to look at the projects, but to be able to identify the projects in the first place. And so origination ends up being quite a challenge. And if there was a centralized repository of information or a platform, that can actually expedite the process. As far as grants, I would agree with you that many of the projects that require grants are already well known and well articulated. But at the same time, there's not necessarily a clear sense. So maybe I need to rephrase what I just said. I don't know if there's as clear an articulation of every single one of these projects and what they aim to do. And I think that's one of the reasons why we see problems in the execution of projects, because the goals and the way that they're delivered does change over time. So my thinking would be, if there's a way to be able to ensure that projects that are seeking grant, so non-repayable funds, are able to be established under a streamlined mechanism, it might actually help to ensure the flow of funds from donor agencies, whether they be bilateral or multilateral, into projects, rather than having it be based on the strength of networks and relationships in the origination of those projects, again, whether they be repayable or non-repayable. I hope that helped. Happy to answer that offline as well. Chris, back over to you.
Thanks, Chairman. I just want to point out to the audience that I see that many of my experts are already jumping on your questions, responding to them via text. As those are answered, they will appear on the Q&A function under the answered column, and you'll be able to read those, or everybody will have access to those. There's a question as well, and this is open to the audience, but how do we get big donors? And this is interesting, it's donors, but I think I would want to open this up to the private sector as well. Big donors and the private sector or governments interested in small but smart projects like energy reduction and chemical savings. These projects should be managed by the utility itself instead of external experts, always an issue in development. Save costs and develop skills for bigger projects. I think I'd like to ask maybe somebody from the bank on this one, and possibly Dennis.
Yeah, happy to jump in. Maybe then Joel could follow up. But we work with a number of utilities around the world, and I think of water and sanitation utilities, and especially in Latin America, for example, we base our interventions on key performance indicators and their overall efficiency, operational and service efficiency. So within those frameworks, it's very much possible to, and we have utilities such as Cagesi in Ceará in Northeast Brazil, who do a lot of small scale innovation under the auspices of a larger engagement. I'll just leave that there for now.
Thanks, Martin.
Let me jump in. Look, on the issue of small scale, we lend across the spectrum. We have very low cost resources, and that's dependent on less than 1% in terms of hard currency through our IDA window. But I think the point is that the full spectrum is looked at, but these funds are definitely demand driven. So it works up from the local authority or the subnational entity all the way to the national level, and then the dialogue starts. And that's the case for most donors involved in this sector. I would add that one of the observations, one on the durability of the sustainability, we completely agree. We've seen those projects too much. And it's something that we do put in place in terms of our projects. But the implementation of that sustainability program is quite critical. And then finally, I would add that on the point about the grant resources themselves, there's a lot of interest and a lot of buzz around this term of blended finance, and the ratio there is quite critical. But the problem isn't about the ratio, it's rather that we have very few service providers who are working towards establishing where that could take place. So we're very much at the beginning compared to other sectors like transportation and energy, and we really have to double down on those technical and financial issues, the transparency around our governance arrangements. Thanks.
We have that's already been answered. I want to put it there because it does go to one of the core pillars of Rock Blue, and that is talking about women's participation in the sector. Half the sky the household, thing else around this. From a young professional in the field, what opportunities for women's participation in WASH, and how does a specialist or how does a young engineer or other professional become engaged in the sector? And then more important, let's turn that around and say, if there is this interest, what are the blockages? What are the challenges currently? And what can all of us on this call and on this panel do to help overcome those? Certainly, Eleanor, Winnie, I think we've got at least one, and Margaret, feel free to tease an experience here.
I had put in a brief response that same opportunity, men and women, in my opinion, and you got to seek those out. And one thing that worked for me through my career is finding people I really respected as role models and figuring out how they got where they got to, and who using them as a person, and also looking at the idea what skills you need to get those jobs are, and figuring out how to build your own tool portfolio.
Thanks, Eleanor. Hey, Winnie, Margaret, anything to add on that?
Yeah, I think that to add on that, there are very many opportunities for women to get in the water sector, because apart from the technical courses, we have courses in human resources, financing, and in water quality. We need water chemists, biologists. So it is for the young women to pursue a career that they feel they're comfortable in, and then they look for employment in the water service providers and in the boards and the research areas that are working in water. So there's a great opportunity for women. They just need to know that they are up to the task and apply. Like in other, there are opportunities for women, and that is why we are saying that women be encouraged to apply for that and rise along the ladder like the men do. So opportunities out there, they just need to have confidence in themselves, apply for the job, and take up the opportunities when they. That's what I would encourage the young women.
Thanks, Margaret.
I just want to chip in there and emphasize the fact that there are as many opportunities for women as there are jobs in the water sector. So women should not think their opportunities are different from the opportunities available for women. That's one thing Elena has pointed out, and I can't emphasize that anymore. There are as many opportunities for women as there are for men. So let the women take up their place and seek out whatever opportunities there are.
Great, and hopefully there's some take up from our attendees here. John, would you like to add something? What can we? I'll guess what can the men on this call? I mean, where are the blockages and what can we do? But please go ahead, John.
Right. Thank you, Chris. Well, one quick comment on this. As many of us have, I've visited a number, dozens, hundreds probably of small communities across the developing world, where not only have I seen women contributing as much as men, in many cases more than men do, to the sustainability and resilience of water programming, but I've actually seen the opposite. The water sector itself provide opportunities to women that might not otherwise be available. Specifically, what I mean by that is women often get their first taste of participatory democracy on village water committees. And that can be a empowering, transformative experience. So a woman joins a water committee in her village, in her neighborhood, in her community, and becomes literate because she has to do the budget 6 months down the road. And then all of a sudden, she's running for city council. She's running for mayor. She's running to become a member of parliament or something like this. So it really is interesting, not just how women are contributing to the water sector, but how the water sector, because of its salience to women's daily lives, really opens doors for women to participate more in their communities as well. It's been really an inspiring two-way street there. Thank you.
All right. I don't want to derail this conversation on this one topic. We're looking at a much broader view, but I'm going to suggest to Peter that we add this to the agenda for our next OLS. And we'll continue that discussion then. I've got several questions coming in around the idea of, does the wash sector have an image problem? Are we struggling to get our message out? Are we enough advocates within local governments and national governments to invest in the sector? And I'm talking about water, I'm talking about sanitation, and the need for that, and especially if we're talking about coming out of COVID, if we're diverting money into economic relief and public health and everything else, how do we make our message heard? And is there a need for a coordinated effort there? Does somebody want to tackle that one? I'm going to pick on somebody and ask Dennis to come up here, give us his global perspective.
Yeah, I think for me, it's the issue of perhaps, I wouldn't call it downplaying the impact, but rather oftentimes it's like the impact is not explained clearly. For example, why build new big hospitals when you can actually address the waterborne or poor sanitation caused diseases? Which means that we need to address the water and sanitation sector side. So I think it's an issue of emphasizing on the impact of poor or lack of both water as well as sanitation.
Somebody else want to jump in on this? Do we have a messaging problem? John.
Hand washing. There are 3 billion people on the planet who don't have water and soap or some sort of hand hygiene. It's unconscionable. I have nothing to say about this. We're missing a huge opportunity, and I'm really struggling with this, so I need people's help on it. There's never been a better time to be a wash advocate. There's never been a better time to be a hand washing with water and soap advocate. And my sense is that somehow the political will is not there to fully take advantage of COVID and emerge more strongly than we went in. It's a real frustration for me as an advocate. So I need the help on this. I need ideas.
I would just jump in, complementing what John said. COVID-19 is predominantly a respiratory disease. Now, if the next one that comes along, if the virus is an Ebola type virus, it is also excreta or excreta related or waterborne, as Dennis was saying. I mean, there are many of them out there. The silent emergency with cholera and dysentery and diarrhea goes on. We get used to it. But if the next big explosion comes directly through excreta or waterborne, you know, we need to position us. We need to be there and be ready. We need to position our sector to say we're essential for cutting these disease transmissions, whether it's through hand hygiene, as John was saying, whether it's through potable water supply or adequate sanitation.
I think to build on that message, Chris, you know, we talked about investment in the sector, and I think putting up a flag for investment into infrastructure is one thing, but I think we should broaden that definition beyond only thinking about initial capital investment costs. I mean, we call this the Marshall Plan, and actually the Marshall Plan sort of massive building after the Second World War. We need to think much broader about investing in the resilience of the entire system that can support the services. There's no use building lots of stuff if you don't have the people and the capacity and the skills and the ongoing recurrent financing to keep all that going, basically. I think Winnie and Eleanor and others picked up on that well around human resources. I mean, in the UK, we're suffering, the health system is suffering from a lack of investment in the last decade or so. We've got CU beds, we don't have nurses and doctors to treat people. So it's about that broader idea of investment, not just how can we get bankable projects in the first place.
Thanks, Harold. That is fantastic feedback, and it's a nice segue into one of our next questions is around how do we achieve these significant improvements that we're seeking today, and specifically around the areas of governance and performance of utility sanitation service providers, where the frameworks and financing and performance itself, that is, you know, on the one hand we say, well, we've got to build up our financial framework, we've got to build up the regulatory, we've got to build up this. How are we going to achieve improvements in circumstances or in contexts where we currently lack that? Is it a chicken and the egg thing? Do we have to do all these preconditions, and do we have time to do that before, say, 2030?
Chris, can I come in on this?
Oh, please.
Yeah, look, I share the frustration that everyone's relaying, and I think it's legitimate. We're just this one step higher. We're in this. Washing is critical. We're in the solution for the SDGs. We go across all, and on building back better. This water is, you know, just in terms of agriculture, if you take it out of the wash sector for a minute, we're central to this. So I think the argument is there. Why isn't it happening? And then what role does governance play in this? I think you've hit the nail on the head in one of the most challenging aspects. We know what to do in terms of making our service efficient, more viable, and ultimately more creditworthy in reducing the risks. The regulatory side, and it's not just regulatory, it's the whole fiduciary responsibility, not just regulation, but tariffs, are all issues I think we know what to do. The real challenge historically over the last 30 or 40 years has been maintaining integrity of those systems. And that's where we really fallen down. And that's beyond the sector. But we sectors have really overcome that. Part of our problem is that we're a highly decentralized sector, but nevertheless, until we start focusing on the integrity of those systems, where they're in place and creating those systems, I think we're not going to see the investment that.
If I can just jump in. So I agree with everything Joel is saying. And at the same time, I think of some of the earlier questions that came through as far as the idea of blended finance. And if there's a way that we can make, so coming to the question on the messaging around the wash sector, if we can start talking about the wash sector for sources of capital that might want to participate from the sector, as the public sector is overstretched as far as its resources, if we can start to find other that wash fits into that brochure, that can be beneficial. So we've been really looking at is the question of wash as part of a circular economy, where we see that sanitation ends up being a useful feedstock or input that leads to productive outputs so that there's financial sustainability of investment opportunities. And so it's no longer a question of how do we get people to want WASH or want to provide WASH services, but how can we bring in other sources of capital to understand the value of investing into WASH? And I think that if we can come up with those sorts of solutions, that can be part of this Marshall Plan idea of reimagining what WASH can be for some of the private sector sources of capital that haven't yet participated in it.
Chris, this point of Jeremy's picks up on something that Leo Mejia has posted around should engineers develop skills in politics? Well, personally, I think the answer is yes. Or rather, we're talking too often the wrong people. So if we really want to make a difference, you really just have to have that extremely solid, high-level political push behind you to make this a priority. Because if you don't, there are lots of other sectors queuing up who are, got louder voices, bigger pockets to fill. And just look at some of the history of countries around the world and how they did it. Southeast Asian countries moved on sanitation and on water in a relatively short order because there was very, very, very high level political push behind it. So yeah, we often maybe talking in the wrong circles perhaps, and we do need to up our game politically.
Yeah,
I would just add, Chris. Sorry, Eleanor, go ahead.
No, sorry to interrupt. I was thinking the same thing, Harold. We, as time goes on, we increasingly see more activity, especially by our country directors, become really, not politically, like as in running for office, but really politically influential. So influencing policy, regulation, national standards, all those types of things are critical to the increase in services, but also connecting ministries of infrastructure with ministries of finance. Lately, I think a big part of the Marshall Plan is connecting ministries of health with ministries of finance and ministries of infrastructure. We didn't do much with ministries of health a year ago. Yeah, maybe a little bit in healthcare facilities, but now we have partnerships across in all our countries because we are critical to the first line of response to COVID. So I think that's also a political skill that our employees have learned, and not something you learn in engineering school, that's for sure.
I would just add to what Eleanor said. Absolutely, we need to articulate our sector with finance, with planning, and with the others that she mentioned. But also, I self-confess I'm an engineer. I think engineers are part of the problem as well. And it's about our education. It's about that we look at solutions from the global north and feel we just need to emulate those when we shouldn't be taking solutions off the shelf. A. B, utilities need to be run, service providers need to be run by managers, not by engineers. There are good managers who are engineers, but not necessarily the other way around. So we need to be choosing people to run service delivery by those that know how to run service delivery.
Just one quick word, basically to add the issue of performance-based for staff in the utilities. I think sometimes we have this civil service kind of mentality. I've been working in Nigeria for the last 3 years or so, and I can see that the challenge is nothing to do with finance. Well, not really nothing, but mainly it's the issue of governance, the issue of staff, and the HR as was mentioned earlier on. Thank you.
So Bill Kingdom points out that when we use the Marshall Plan, we use that as a hook, but when we put that into context, the investment in the Marshall Plan, according to Bill, accounted for 5% of the United States GDP at that time. It would be about $1 trillion in 2020 terms, which would go a long way towards meeting SDG 6. I'm sure a couple of economists here can correct those numbers, but it is an interesting thought when we talk about a plan or a reform. Do we need to mobilize that amount of money? And I'm going to use that as a related question to that. We talk about private sector mobilization here, but let's clarify. The question has come up, directed to Joel, but we can expand this wider. Is the 1990s privatization model in the WASH sector dead 30 years later? or is there a viable or some new way of bringing in that private sector investment into resolving or achieving that $1 trillion investment?
Okay, thanks. Look, picking up on Dennis's points, it's certainly evolved, right? I'm not sure it's dead, but it's certainly not what it was in the 1990s. And as Dennis said, it's really not about financing anymore. It's about making our service providers attractive for finance, whether it's grant finance or reimbursable finance. I think one of the lessons from COVID is why would a Ministry of Finance put more grant money, even in the time of COVID, to a utility that's collecting 40 or 50% of the revenue that's available? I think we have to become more responsible as providers. I think we have to become more political as well and politically savvy. But I think in terms of your specific question, Chris, I don't think it's dead per se. You see there's no such thing as a traditional PPP. And no one is saying anymore walking away from the sector and let the private sector take over from the public side. That is not happening anywhere. But you see private investment playing and private operators playing major roles in certain geographic areas, the MENA region in particular, but Latin America and Asia, a little bit in West Africa too. So those providers, if you look at who they are, they've transformed. They are different, but they're still involved in the sector. What's interesting is the financiers of the sector historically, since the 90s and before that, actually over the last couple hundred years, the private financiers have remained the same. Sorry, I shouldn't say a couple hundred years. Over the last 100 years, they've been pension funds, insurance companies, and long-term investors who are putting in the infrastructure investments we need. But that's not the problem. We see that money going into transport and energy and other places. They're looking for viable investments, and that means our service providers have to be efficient, and the governance and institutional and regulatory arrangements have to be very clear and transparent, implemented with integrity. Thanks.
And if I were to jump in, but I feel like every time Joel speaks, I want to jump in on what he's saying, because I fully agree. And I'm sitting here as a private sector investor who has capital to put in, and my investment committee effectively has said, we're not interested in investing directly into public sector utilities. We will invest into the private sector because they operate in a way which is far more understandable. They're more accountable, and there's not necessarily going to be the challenges as far as that. Take Kenya, for example, the replacement of a board of directors because there is somebody who makes a decision that something needs to change, and that's not driven by the financial practices. And so if the people that I speak to say we will not participate in public sector opportunities because we have too many concerns, yet we'll go in on the private sector side, then I think that just bolsters that argument. And maybe one of the things, Peter, that Rock Blue could look at is do an analysis of the private sector financiers and ask what it would take for them to put money into the public sector utilities, especially the utilities that Rock Blue already supports, and see, is there something that needs to be changed beyond creditworthiness, beyond technical assistance, and getting projects to a place where it all makes sense? Because I feel like otherwise, this is going to be a circular conversation, and 50 years from now, people will watch this video and say, wow, it didn't work then, and it's still not working today.
Thanks, Jeremy. I have, I think, 2 minutes left on this session before we hand over to the full thing, and I want to direct this and challenge my boss, Peter Macy. We have a question that challenges your ROC principles. He suggests that they don't specifically or explicitly include serving the poor, and says maybe he missed that. And the question goes on to say that the challenge in the sector is to have viable service providers while also making sure that we serve the poor. And it's that combination that creates the fundamental tension in the sector. And I think this also builds on the question about privatization and viability. How do you respond to that, Peter, and the broader audience?
So the acronym that we use, ROCKS, is for what we consider the tenets of durability or sustainability. How do we build something that's going to last? So it doesn't address other areas of the work that we do in water and sanitation and hygiene. It addresses just durability. What does it take for our investments, our efforts, for them to last beyond 5 or 10 years? Now, I would say, in terms of addressing the issue to the poor, if we don't make our investments and our efforts and the dollars that we spend more durable, more lasting, it is going to penalize the poor. There's just not enough money to go around. And so we've got to try and get it right the first time, and to have the efforts that we're engaged in last much longer than they have in the past. Most of those on this call have been around for decades, doing what we do for decades. And so we've all seen how many of these projects have failed in too short a period of time. And so the whole point of ROCKS and the tenets of durability is for the projects to last, and therefore for the poor, who are the ones who are most affected by the lack of WASH, for them to have those services. So while it's not a direct impact, in answer to the attendee's question, it is definitely an indirect advantage for these projects to last. So
Can I quickly jump in here, Chris? This discussion of the poor and their services and the private sector, they're actually linked as well, because the irony of our sector is everyone has a service. Everyone has water supply every day, or they wouldn't be here. It may be inadequate, it may be too expensive, it may be a number of things. And everyone has to go to the toilet every day, right? So they have some sort of inappropriate, often, sanitation system. Those systems are those services are often delivered by the private sector, the informal private sector. So it's about understanding that, understanding what people are paying for services today, and how can you improve those, regulate them, and expand them. And picking up on one of Louise's points, you know, there's a number of smaller scale innovations going on. How can we measure those, understand them, and then expand them to get to where Bill's saying we need to get to? Those and other, you know, rational service providers, and bringing in there's a spectrum of the private sector. There's a big private sector, you know, there are the concessions in Manila, for example. There are PPPs for wastewater treatment plants and for reuse, as someone was referring to. And there's a small scale private sector as well. And there are DBO, design, build, operate approaches, and other things. But how can we bring all of these elements together and move services for the poor and for everyone in the city forward?
Thanks, Martin. Unfortunately, I've got to cut off now, but it is my great pleasure to hand off to the founder of Rock Blue, Peter Macy, for our final session. I just want to add that we've received a huge list of great questions from our audience, and thank you very much for your contributions. When we post the recording of this the webinar on rockblue.org, we will also be endeavoring to answer all of those questions in writing. So please come back, check those, and follow up on those. And you'll also have the opportunity, I'm sure that all of our experts here would be very keen to engage on one-on-ones and follow-up questions as well. So I'll take the liberty of offering that for those follow-ups. In particular, we had a number of questions around the role of technology. And I think that's a great topic, and maybe one that we can explore in a future OLS session. No further ado, Peter, please save me.
Okay, Chris, you can turn off your video. I'll take over right now for the last segment here. So this last segment is about the how for all these great ideas. And so the panelists that you've been hearing from for the past hour are all obviously very accomplished. And the reason they are accomplished, they've been able to turn ideas into reality and to solve big problems, whatever steps are necessary. So first of all, it's an honor to be here amongst all these experts in WASH. But what I'd like to do now is to challenge each and every one of you, and I'll be going to the pre-recorded video that you had and asking questions in terms of the how of your very good idea, how we can put that into practice so that by the end of this year, we do see some measurable impacts on SDG 6. Maybe this is the start of something akin to a Marshall Plan, I don't know, but what I would like is that this is the start to have a major impact on SDG 6. So let me just jump in. John, I'll let you be the first guinea pig here. You brought up some really good ideas with regards to governments from top down needing to communicate their water commitments clearly to end users. I think it's a great idea. You also talked about needing a well-paved two-way street between people and their governments at local and national levels. My question for you is, it's a great idea, but there's a lot of roadblocks to making that happen. What are your suggestions in terms of the how between now and say the end of the year for this not to fail, for this really to work?
Yeah, boy, Peter, thank you. That's exactly the right question to ask, is, put us all on the spot. Let me answer it by echoing Bill Kingdom's question about how do you get from billions to trillions? How do we get to a real Marshall Plan here? And governments and households across the developing world are the key. It is a combination of household tariffs and public finance that's going to produce the vast, vast, vast majority of the finance needed to solve this problem, needed to meet the SDGs. So what's the role of governments? Well, governments must prioritize their WASH funding. They must prioritize their WASH implementation. But the point I really want to make is that they have to be public about it. And dare I say, governments should take credit for it, within electoral timeframes and long beyond. So be public, take credit, but then also, of course, governments should expect to be held accountable by their customers. And by customers, I mean citizens, voters, ratepayers. So tomorrow morning, you ask how? Tomorrow morning, governments should post water commitments, progress reports, budgets, not just in the political capital, but at every state, every province, every district, every household, every neighborhood, every school, every healthcare facility. Be open, be transparent, let citizens, voters, ratepayers know clearly what to expect and what governments expect from them. And there are a lot of platforms for this. And if more people have cell phones or internet access than have access to toilets, okay, yeah, first of all, that's bad. But secondly, take advantage of those communications platforms. And let me say, the second answer to your how question is that this isn't just about developing country governments, but donor governments and private donors have a responsibility here as well. So how do you do it? Tomorrow morning, I would encourage donor countries and private donors to revisit your programming, to be sure that you are decentralizing ownership, to be sure that you are decolonizing aid, that you are communicating your work properly, openly, transparently, so that citizens in those countries know what to expect from your project and how to relay to you or others any suggestions they have or concerns that they have. The third quick answer, a homework assignment for contractors and NGOs, for-profit or not-for-profit, doesn't matter to me. But tomorrow morning, think about not waiting until the ribbon cutting ceremony to invite the mayor. Invite her to day one of the design phase of the project, not just the ribbon cutting ceremony. Take a look at your programming tomorrow morning and ask yourself whether you can better engage with government at all levels, especially as we emerge from COVID, when I think the timing is right. And then secondly, how you as a contractor, how you as an NGO can better integrate advocacy into your programs. And as you're looking for technical partners, look for civil society partners, country by country, that can help with the marketing and the advocacy questions that we've all raised today. I hope that gets us started, Peter.
Very much so. That's the real how. I appreciate that, John. All right, let me, first of all, any of the other panelists, you're welcome to jump in if you feel so inspired. Let me quickly go to you, Jeremy, for a similar question. You talked about creating a platform where there's a link between the seekers and the sources of capital. It's a great idea, I like it, but how do you actually make it happen by the end of the year? And to use John's terminology, what do you do tomorrow to get this started?
So I think that if you want to get this started, you probably need to have a few easy wins that you can show. So it would be whether you want to say that it's the low-hanging fruit or whatever other terminology you want to imagine. Projects that already effectively will be able to access funding and financing. So whether it be grant funding or repayable finance, in either instance, being able to say, so here's what the platform would actually be able to do, and be able to imagine that project X with sponsor Y is able to get funding from these three organizations, whether it be public sector, private sector, whatever else the case might be, as far as the financiers or the funding source. So I think that being able to show that this already hypothetically would work would be the first step. I'm going to make a recommendation that some people might not like, but I think that we probably need to imagine that this sort of a platform is hosted somewhere that's not owned by a hypothetical funding source, but instead by somebody who's a non-aligned entity. So a group that's part of the WASH sector, but not necessarily a funder or a grant provider themselves, but instead really that agnostic source that says, it doesn't matter to us where the funding comes from to deliver on this project. What's more important is that we are a platform or a facilitator of this. And as others have said, one of the most important things to do is to look at other sectors that have successfully done something like this. And this has been successfully delivered in other sectors. So I think that part of this would be, how do we lift and make it a plug and play into the WASH sector, and also show the sources of capital that the WASH sector should not be viewed as something so different. I think that there's been, again, back to that messaging question, there have been a lot of people who've made WASH into something else, which almost becomes unapproachable for people because it's, well, this is a basic human right, and we can't talk about monetizing or making it into something that is understood by the financiers. I think the more that we can do that makes this approachable for people who have the ability to invest large amounts of money, the better off this sector can be. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeremy.
Maybe
Joel, did
Peter-
you want to follow up on that?
Peter,
Yeah, just very briefly on Jeremy. Look, I agree with the concept. I can't help but wonder whether it doesn't already exist. And the key may be shadow credit ratings. You know, these are a technique that's been around for 40 or 50 years. There are problems with them, don't get me wrong. But a private rating where a recognized financial institution comes in and does an assessment of your financial health, I think is a key first step. They're relatively inexpensive. They can be kept confidential, and they are certainly seen as being independent. So in your question, Peter, of how, I think one aspect of this is shadow credit ratings. Other sectors, particularly in energy, use them quite extensively. I think it's an opportunity in water that we haven't exploited enough. However, I would add to that, just because you're starting to look at private sector financing, we also need to go to the Ministry of Finance and relay that that doesn't mean the sector needs to be cut off. And I think what service providers and CEOs and managing directors that I talk to are very worried about going down this slope because they're fearful that the Ministry of Finance will cut them off. And if anything, anyone who starts down that path, we have an obligation to go hand in hand with them to the Ministry of Finance, that this is the right move, but don't cut them off yet. So that would be my short answer on the how. Thanks.
Thanks, Joel. Harold, did you want to add something?
Yeah, just maybe as a little plug to what Jeremy asked about, does this already exist? And I come from the backwater of the backwater, which is the rural water sector, subsector. And there's a group called Uptime. They're actually trying to establish this mechanism to link money, financing, whether it's public, private, wherever, with professionalized maintenance service providers who have some kind of transparent performance metrics applied to them. So yeah, maybe you need to go the next step, as Joel said, in terms of looking at their credit worthiness. That's probably a long step away, but these things are being developed. And I think it is the way forward in terms of how do you put your hands around a lot of small potential operators and the need for financing. So it is out there. Check them out, as they are made up about 6 or 7 operators. Uptime. We can put the link in the box for anybody later on who needs it.
Thanks, Harold. I knew anything on finance was going to get some responses here. Let me jump to Winnie. I've got a question for you. You had 2 good comments. One is the need to increase capacity of women in soft skills, and the other was to spotlight initiatives championed by women. can you provide some specifics on that? How would you actually make that happen? It's a great idea. It's going to result in some dramatic increases in the water sector, but how do you actually make that happen?
I'll start with the easier part, which is spotlighting initiatives championed by women. It's really to take the time to get information on what is out there, what are women-led initiatives. And once you have a platform, say, let's use this as one of those platforms. For example, if the topic was financing and how to acquire more finances for whatever you're doing, it would be interesting to find some women who have had projects that have been financed, and then they share how they acquired these finances. That's what spotlighting is about. It's just about any topic that is being discussed, and then taking the time to know which women have benefited or have information on these things, and then bringing them to share. So it's really easy, just bringing the women forward to share and talk about how, for example, they got financing or whatever initiatives they are leading in their communities. Spotlighting is really just bringing them forward so more people can know. That's what I meant by spotlighting. On the soft skills, this is a personal thing. So if it's about improving, say, for example, one's communication skills, it requires that we encourage women to speak more, to take up the leadership more. It's really about encouraging them to keep doing these things. Soft skills are only built by participation. I was thinking of this platform now. We have the women talking about women empowerment, and we have the guys talking about financing of investments. One way that this platform could have empowered women is to just switch the topics, such that the women are talking about the financing. How can we attract more financing into the sector? What does that do to the woman? It pushes her to understand more and to also research more. It's another way of empowering. So building the soft skills is really, you only reach that by throwing people into the deep end. There is no easy way to do that. So that's my quick answer on that.
Okay.
Just a quick build on that. I think the women on this panel are very competent in the operations side as well. We could be able to answer, we're able to answer those questions. The other thing I wanted to mention earlier, didn't have a chance to, getting more women in the sector also requires men supporting more women in the sector, from the community base all the way up to the top. So having men as allies that believe and support women is crucial to success also. So I think that's really important to mention as well, because there are more men than women. So it's just sometimes the math, that's the way it works out.
Peter, can I come in on this?
Go ahead, Joel.
In my day job, I actually run one of the largest think tanks in water in the developing world, and we have a whole unit that works on the inclusion agenda. And I think one of the transformations over the last couple of years has been moving from stovepiped approaches, where we really just look at gender, to bringing it into every aspect of our program. So every loan that goes to our board now, our team looks at it in terms of enhancing the opportunities, both in terms of staff, but also in terms of customers as well. And there's a growing body of analytical work around this, and this mainstreaming process is quite critical. We've learned a lot from the citywide inclusive sanitation. You know, you just don't make people sanitation experts. They have to be across the board, as Dennis and Martin have said, and we're trying to do, and we are doing the same thing with the inclusion agenda. So it has to be across the board, and it has to be everybody talking about it. Thanks.
I just add very quickly, Peter, the citywide inclusive sanitation team that I'm leading at the World Bank is somewhere around 95% women. And, you know, I mean, they're young professionals, they're senior, they're seasoned professionals. There's a whole gamut of them. And yeah, it's fantastic. And it's, I don't know, it's naturally there. I think it's something that is happening more and more in our sector. I hope, that's what I see, at least.
Well, I would echo that opinion. I mean, this is the reason why even at Rock Blue, we sort of transformed our organizational structure. Even our board is now 50% women and led by a woman. We see the impact that they're having, and we know that it's going to have a bigger impact on WASH. We have very little time left. Eleanor, I want to turn this over to you because you talked about WASH institutions. This is sort of the umbrella over everything that we do. There were great ideas. How do we make it actually happen? Where they don't exist, how do we make that happen? Can you put some how into your suggestions?
Sure, these are long processes as much in the water sector. So in our experience at Water for People, either creating WASH institutions or supporting them and strengthening them is a long-term process. But the basic components are getting the right people there and then giving them the right skills and training and having the right governance and monitoring to ensure things are moving forward. Now, as often is the case, it's not linear, right? Sometimes there'll be improvements in water quality or rate collection or operational maintenance, and then things change and things go backwards. So having long-term agreements with districts or municipalities and having that backstopping of either that co-financing, and so part of the budget always goes to the district WASH office is critical to success. And then having a succession of upskilling or skilling people working in the sector, because often these are first jobs. I'm speaking in the rural sector now, right? So these are the first time these jobs have existed, and having people come into the roles and having them be really respected in their community. So that brings into the value of the water and sanitation service growing. People believe that the tariffs are paying fair and right because they enjoy the service, and they come to rely on those services. Another important part of that is the water resources management component, which we've come to really appreciate Water for People because we lost many water sources over the years, not thinking about that, really focused on the engineering side of the infrastructure, and then like water sources dried up. So being right in the beginning in the development of the water systems is also making sure the watersheds are properly protected and their water resources plans in place for long-term, as well as knowing where potential redundant water sources come from, because that is critical to success and very much accelerating with all the climate emergencies we're seeing in all our countries where we work. That is also a critical component. So having experts in water resources management is really part of the Water and Sanitation Office responsibility.
Thanks, Ellen. Okay, we have just 5 minutes left. I promise you that the remaining questions that we have out there will be answered. But I'm gonna let Harold, I'm gonna let you close on this. The systems approach to a lot of people is a little bit hard to grasp. Maybe it's a little bit too big, maybe it's too gray, but it's a good approach, and it sort of follows on what Eleanor was talking about as well. And a good systems approach is actually more efficient, and it's going to yield better results if it's done right. The question I have for you, Harold, though, is going beyond the idea. How do we actually make it happen?
Good, you got me on the spot just under the deadline. Look, I think, you talk about systems approach, it can mean everything and nothing, but there's clear evidence that where we do have a good system in place or a good enough system in place, i.e. in many countries in the north, the system, the operations work, services are delivered, there's regulation, there's financing, there's means of financing, et cetera, et cetera. So we know when a system does work. So there's the proof in terms of its importance. How do we do this, and how do we do it by the end of the year? I was a bit dreading the answering your question on that one with just months to go. I think is challenging, but interestingly, what John mentioned around governments should be public about it. That was my first on the list, and we haven't compared notes. So first thing I think is a clear statement of intent by government to say, these are important aspects of delivering services, and we stand up and we own that, and we speak together with external partners, the idea of collective action, and you can't solve this on your own. So government's making a very clear statement of intent. I think the second practical thing is, this is probably going on in many countries, is a kind of a task force for COVID recovery, which looks at the investments, looks at where those points in the system failure are. So what has not been resilient enough during the COVID crisis? Is it around your HR? Is it around the financing and withdrawal, suspension of tariffs? What is it that's causing those points of failure? And really trying to drill down on those, understand them collectively, and say, right, we have a joint vision or a joint plan to address those. And linked to that, thirdly, is an investment plan, which takes into account not just capital investment. We know that's ongoing, but what we talked about earlier in terms of really looking at treating the underlying causes of those failures in the system. And that could be very long term. It could be long-term plans around human resources, investing in professionals. And I think linked to that, and finally, is that something you could do in the short term is to try and really get out to frontline staff, operators, utility managers, local government staff, and have some informed discussions around, what's working and what's not. So really try and sensitize. It's all around mindsets and behaviors, whether that's organizational, whether that's individuals. And I think it's really important to put those discussions on the table. And you'd really do in some of those sessions that we've been involved in supporting as AgriConsult, you almost see the scales falling from people's eyes when you start to really dig into, why is this failing? What's behind that? Is it really lack of money? Or is it because you've got a bunch of engineers in charge who just think pouring a load of concrete will solve your problem? So really maybe rolling those out as almost like a town hall, I think you call them in the US, sort of public forum on discussions around what's not working. That takes, facilitation, it takes time, but I think you could start that process between now and the end of the year. So not easy, and changing organizations' incentives and behaviors is a difficult thing, but I think we can put some lines in the sand and say, yes, this can be done in the short term. So those are my 2 or 3 points.
Thanks, Harold, and sorry for putting you on the spot at the end of the webinar. I know you'll get me back for that.
No problem.
All right, to all the panelists, thank you very much, particularly those from the US who have given up part of their holiday, their President's Day holiday, to attend this webinar. I also want to thank the attendees to this webinar. There were some amazing questions and even great solutions or answers from those on the call. We're gonna assemble all those. We're gonna get them out. The whole goal is not just to be talking points and to have ideas, but to move this towards a substantial impact on SDG 6. And so you can hold us, Rock Blue, accountable, and the panelists accountable for making that happen. But again, thank you to the panelists and thank you to the attendees. Chris, for closing, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Peter. And echoing your sentiments, thank you to all of our participants today. Thank you to our panelists. On behalf of Rock Blue, please check out our website, www.rockblue.org. By, let's say, the end of the month, please check on there and we'll have a recording of today's webinar up there with answers to all of your questions. And if you enjoyed today's presentation and want to support what we do, please find out how you can be part of our team on the website. Also, as we close today, please do us the favor of completing the survey. Let us know how we can improve. With that, I will say thanks to everyone. Stay safe, stay healthy, and keep doing the good work. Cheers, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.